is the worst thing that a therapist has ever told you? Story 1. I was 16, my parents had mental issues, and I was suffering a lot. She told me that if I couldn't handle it, I should quit my studies and left my home. I had to remind her that in our country you can't work if you are under 18. And what a terrible idea was stop studying. I left and never came back. Story 2. Me. Acne, bad teeth, puberty, tons of insecurities, extreme shyness, depression. Therapist. I think the reason why you're 18 and don't have a girlfriend yet is because you're gay. Dude. Story 3. That I was mentally ill because I didn't want children. Like that I had a totally separate, distinct mental illness from the MDD I was there for, because I didn't want or like children. She spent a long time trying to cure me of it. Story 4. I am not able to continue seeing you anymore because your mother thinks I am helping you too much. She was my favorite therapist too, and still to this day I'm upset at my dysfunctional mother for making me stop seeing her. Story 5. My therapist made fun of me when I told her I thought I was schizophrenic. I was absolutely shocked. But then she explained what schizophrenia was and that she was pretty sure I didn't have it. Gotta say, it was in a period in which I thought I was going crazy. Surprisingly enough, her no-nonsense and direct approach was something that appealed to me. After 20 sessions, all was well, and she was right all along. I suffered from hypochondriasis. It's when you think you're suffering from all kinds of things. My therapist was absolutely the best fit for me. Story 6. It wasn't so much what he said, more just his demeanor and body language. He yawned through most of the session and kept looking at the clock next to me every couple of minutes. He just gave off an air of absolute disinterest and boredom. After resisting going to therapy for years and basically being urged to go by friends, having this as my first interaction with a therapist was a major letdown. Story 7. A few here. There was one therapist who kept telling me I reminded him of suicides he knew. I think this was supposed to be a warning, but his phrasing made it come off as a suggestion. Winner was probably, yeah, you're probably going to want to drink a lot more now, and that's fine. Which is why you should avoid therapy in Wisconsin. Not really, obviously. Don't avoid therapy. You're loved. Story 8. Not worst, but I'll take my time to vent a little. I find it super annoying and obnoxious that my therapist makes a big fuss over my friends having foreign names. Always asking where people I mention are from, meaning their ethnicity. Just really annoying and borderline offensive, and shows how narrow-minded her worldview is. Story 9. It's only abuse if it happens more than once. It's not abuse if it only happens one time. Yeah, okay, so getting shoved against the wall and kneed in the chest is okay as long as it only happens once. Got it. Story 10. A therapist encouraged the attachment therapy I was undergoing. I only recently was made aware that was fucked up. I actually got that realization from an AskReddit post that was, "What is the darkest internet rabbit hole you've gone down?" For me, they called it RAD time, because RAD stood for reactive attachment disorder. It still fucks with me. I just thought it was a normal part of foster care. I talked to my therapist about it, and they told me that I wasn't trying to get better. And if you could just be good and fun to be around, maybe someone would want to keep you. I recently learned that respectful, responsible, fun to be around is pretty much the slogan for this pseudo-scientific abuse. The CPTSD still disrupts my life, but I am proud to say that in my adult life, not living under the choices of the overworked and well-meaning but misinformed turnover of social workers has changed my life for the better. I aged out of foster care. I have an organic support system now. And I am loved. I spread as much love and kindness as I can, every single fucking day. Story 11. I have a lot of problems, mainly trust issues, so I went to therapy for it. Had to change therapists like 4 times because, apparently, they all believe patient confidentiality is a rule that they don't have to follow. Finally found one that treated it like it was supposed to be treated, or so I thought. She came to a school play I was in, and I didn't think anything of it until I saw her social media post going into detail about what I was in therapy for and some sappy bullshit about how she was glad I overcame it all. How did I find this social media post, you may ask? Why, it was on the front page of the school website. Because she tagged the school in it, and the school decided to put it on the front page of their website for everyone to see. Story 12. It's what she didn't say. She literally fell asleep. She was the only one offered in my area that my insurance covered. Also, she was like 800 years old. Story 13. I had a nurse once try to diagnose me with a personality disorder that A, I don't have, and B, she wasn't qualified to diagnose, because I didn't feel safe or comfortable enough around her to talk to her about why I tried to end my life. Story 14. You don't have PTSD. Go back to your unit. Army shrink dismissing my concerns. 20 years later, a civilian shrink diagnosed me with PTSD and PTSD-related depression. Story 15. Not a therapist, but a school counselor who was there for mental health issues specially told me, "You'll never be anyone's first priority," when I was talking about my loneliness. Story 16. First session. I am telling her about myself. I was pregnant at the time and had a 1-year-old at home as well. Told her I was a stay-at-home mom by choice, and she asked if I had ever heard of feminism and suggested my depression was due to a lack of career, despite the fact that I've suffered from depression and anxiety since I was 11. Also been a feminist for just about as long, so yeah, off Joyce. Story 17. When I was 14 and first taken to therapy, my therapist straight up told to me that because she has never seen me cry, I might have psychopathic tendencies. Even back then I was baffled because I've always had a hard time crying in front of people, but hearing that still fucked me up for a long time. Story 18. We should meet more often. Cost me more money for less result. Therapy could probably be useful if you get the right one at the right time. Otherwise, I think it just costs a lot. Story 19. My therapist gave me her number in case I needed anything outside our sessions. She must have been busy or something, because I called her once saying my panic attack was so severe I was feeling suicidal. She said you'll be okay and hung up. Our next session, she sent me to an inpatient facility because I was too much for her, I guess. Story 20. While trying to convince me to go on medication for suicidal thoughts, she described it thusly. You'll still be angry and sad. You'll just be too tired to do anything about it. Story 21. My therapist suggested me to read my boyfriend's personal text messages. Said my friend probably has Asperger's by knowing just a few facts about him. Said my sister is fucking her 5-year daughter by breastfeeding her because she's too old for that. Convinced me I have bipolar without actually testing me or suggesting to do so. And I do not have bipolar. She was the worst. Story 22. I had never told anyone about having been raped. It was in a lesbian relationship, which makes it extra difficult to tell about, since people still think lesbian rape does not happen. I had gone to a therapist to get therapy after growing up with a narcissistic parent. After a couple of visits, I thought to myself that I trusted the therapist enough to tell him about the rape. So I tried to find courage to tell. I started to cry. He just looked at me, unresponsive, seemed to wait for me to get to the point. So I said, apart from my mother chasing my father with knives in the middle of the night, there are more things that has happened to me. I paused. Now, I thought, I am going to tell somebody. Then my therapist interrupted me with this. It is not my job to listen to you when you dwell upon things. This is not what CBT is for. I went to him a couple of times after that, but he became a trigger of PTSD, since all I could think about when I saw his face was rape, and that I was not allowed to tell anyone about it. But one day I realized how stupid this was, so I stopped going. I ended up telling my husband instead, I am bi, and we had a really good talk about it. I read up on PTSD and narcissistic behavior, and got a lot of help from RCPTSD. I can still be triggered by certain things, but I am much more stable now and am living a really good life. It took several months to recover from the comment, though, especially since my upbringing was with an unstable authoritative figure. In my country, CBT is the only therapy you can get for trauma, unless you are suicidal or can't work or study at all. I am aware that CBT is not the best type of therapy for trauma, but thought I might try since it is basically for free where I live. Story 23. I can't take you on as a client. You seem like you have too many issues, after seeing a therapist who was listed to have experience with the things I was seeking therapy for. That was after an intro session. Story 24. When I was 10, my mom was concerned that something was wrong with me because I didn't have friends, chose to hang with my animals most days, and my extracurricular activities didn't include typical girl things. My school recommended taking me to this local child psychologist. He told my parents that I was a boy trapped in a girl's body, and that if they let me transition, I'd be much happier. When my parents tried to tell him that wasn't the case, he filed a complaint with DHS saying my parents weren't handling my psychological well-being. The complaint never went anywhere, and a few years later he lost his license. In reality, I was being bullied at school to the point of almost commuting suicide. Eventually, my parents found a much better therapist who was actually helpful, got switched to online school, and life got better. This was almost 15 years ago, and I don't know how differently things would have played out if they'd listened to him. Story 25. Therapy cannot be interrupted until it's complete. Interrupting it will nullify any results. Fucking charlatan wanted me to keep paying until the end of my life without giving any help. Glad I interrupted it. Story 26. I told her about my issues and she said it was hormones, and that every teenager goes through this. She totally nullified my problems and it felt very impersonal. Story 27. To start keeping a journal just for her and me so we can go over my feelings together. She then proceeded to read it aloud to my mother during our next family session. Story 28. Marriage counselor. I called to cancel all of the booked sessions because I had finally thrown my husband out when he overdrew my bank account and almost bounced the mortgage payment to get cash for his dealer. Her response was only, "Well, call me back if you change your mind," as if that was an option I should be considering. Story 29. 14 years old, went in and was talking to the guy I assume gets to assign a therapist to you? Not quite sure, but he was asking me what I was looking to discuss with a therapist. Told him I was trans and he said, "Are you sure you're not just a lesbian?" Lol, what? He went on to explain, "Well, I'm gay too. It just might make your life easier." Luckily, I was smart enough to know that was a complete nonsense statement. What an inappropriate thing to say, especially to a kid who was barely trying to figure themselves out. Story 30. Called me on a Sunday night to tell me she was closing her practice effective immediately due to COVID, and she just didn't like doing the Zoom sessions she had been trying. I find out a few weeks later she never closed the practice, and I guess that was just her way of getting rid of me as a client? She never responded to my request for an explanation. Another, when I told her about being selected to attend training to become a peer mental health counselor. "How could you possibly help anyone?" in a disgusted tone. This lady went on to tell me intimate details of her life, details of how her husband was physically abusing her, and use me as her emotional support and counselor the many times she would temporarily reel up with her husband. Story 31. Told me to find Jesus. I'm already a Catholic and actively pray. She knew that and said I wasn't praying hard enough, that if I prayed harder, I wouldn't be suffering as much as I am. Story 32. I have a client who was told by a previous therapist that it was her fault she was physically abused in her previous relationship because she introduced violence. She smacked him on one occasion for not respecting her boundaries, and no. My client cried when I told her that was bullshit. I take a very straightforward approach with some clients and she responds very well with it. We've made a lot of progress and she's definitely far happier than she was when we first started working together. I'm still really angry at the victim blaming she went through. Story 33. I had a psychiatrist look at my chart, shake his head, and tell me there was nothing else he could do for me and that I was a hopeless case. I called him in and left, slamming the door, of course. I also had another therapist tell me to just man up. Story 34. I was in an insane abusive relationship and wanted to make sure I was getting a therapist who would take it seriously. A lot of people seemed to dismiss the abuse because I was with a woman, for some reason. So I picked a therapist who said she specialized in gay and lesbian issues. I came in on our first session and opened up, just enough to feel vulnerable, though I realized I didn't explicitly tell her I was a lesbian. Then asked her what it means to specialize in gay and lesbian issues. I figured she'd tell me she had some kind of certification or studies pertaining to the LGBT community or something. Her response was, "I see them," in the most disgusted, condescending tone. I said, "I don't understand. What does that mean?" And she said, "A lot of people won't see the gays. I'm willing to. Thanks for your magnanimity." I was so angry and hurt. Story 35. When my parents were getting divorced, my mom sent me to my father's therapist. I told the therapist how abusive my father had always been, and the therapist thought it was a good idea to tell 13-year-old me that my father had told him he had hated me from the moment I was born because I was a girl. Story 36. Long story short, she was very, very much into metaphysical. "You're not depressed, your chakras just aren't aligned," led to "none of this matters, you're just identifying and projecting into things." Bitch. My mom has a brain tumor. We're in the midst of a pandemic. I moved 1,500 miles away from everything and everyone I knew. I have nothing solid going for me in life and no signs of growth anywhere. And you're telling me to disassociate and align my chakras. Story 37. I was depressed as a teenager, lifelong depression, and my mom sent me to a therapist. Out of nowhere, he started talking about autoerotic asphyxiation. Also, one that clearly didn't give AE and wasn't listening, so asked the same question about stuff she clearly knows. Story 38. It wasn't what she told me, it was what she didn't. I squared our accounts one day and she gave me a hug and told me, "I'm so glad that you have gotten to a place of trusting people." Next week, she ghosted me. You read that right? My therapist, who I was seeing for my deep-seated trust issues, ghosted me after I got to the point of trusting her. Story 39 told me I needed to find God or some other higher power to look to. I've never been religious and respect that people look to a higher power to rely on, but it just felt very out of line and was not what I needed at the time. A few years down the road, I found a great therapist who doesn't push religion or her beliefs on me, and I'm doing much, much better. Story 40. I am female, and I grew up without a father or any males in my family. All girls. I struggled with suicidal thoughts, insecurities, and lots of family drama. I dated a lot of guys when I was 16 to 20 years old, trying to find something about myself worth loving and filling the void inside me. I had one really good female friend in school, and I loved her because she was my first true friend. I began seeing my school's therapist when I was about 16 years old. I told him about my issues, family, my one friend, and the dating. He wrote down everything I said and never really commented. I went 3 times. Every time the only thing he cared about was asking me if I was gay, because I talked about my friend, glossing over all the guys I was dating. He would use 10 minutes just trying to convince me I liked my friend in a sexual way. I'll never forget the feeling he gave me. He was such a creep. I asked other people I knew went to him, and they had similar experiences. One girl told me he also asked her about being gay bi multiple times. She had a boyfriend. And another girl told me he put his hand on her thigh in an inappropriate way. I still believe 10 years later that he went home jacking off to girls crying in his office and fantasizing about them being gay. I reported him to the school 6 months after ending my sessions. They couldn't do anything about it then because I had waited too long to report it. Story 41. A therapist recently told me that there was no point in seeing her anymore because they clearly couldn't help me. I had been back several times at this point to an NHS-covered counseling organization, which only offered a limited amount of sessions. She told me I needed private counseling on a regular basis, which I agree with. But when I told her I could not afford private counseling, she responded by saying, "Well, it's about investing in yourself, and if you can't find it in you to do that, you're never going to get better." Suffice to say, I switched therapist after that session. Story 42. You're just getting to an age where it's tempting to be lazy. Put your nose to the grindstone and you'll be fine. 1 year and a rapid spiral into suicidal tendencies later, I got diagnosed with a whole host of issues from someone who knew being a teenager and having mental illness weren't mutually exclusive. That year was fun, though, because being dismissed by a professional meant no one took me seriously, even when I begged for help. Story 43. I don't believe you. And then proceeded to defend my mother and call me a self-centered brat who would rather see themselves as a victim rather than just admit that I was being a horrible child to my mother, who was working really hard to make ends meet and raise multiple kids on her own. And that if abuse had actually taken place, then child services would have already taken me away and my father, and likely my mother as well, would have been in jail. I had decided to fully open up about all the abuse I had gone through and how I had started researching psychology a lot in school to try to understand why I was having so many more problems than other kids my age. And I ended up thinking that maybe all of my outbursts were just me trying to find a way to push through or work things out somehow in my hormonal teen brain. The extra kicker, child services had tried taking us away multiple times a year from elementary school to middle school because we'd constantly show up without food. Clothes would be in complete disrepair. We showed signs of multiple types of abuse, etc. Story 44. When talking about my abusive parents, she suggested maybe I need to think about what they were going through at the time and to give them the benefit of the doubt. I still feel angry when I think back on this. Like, I needed to vent to someone impartial. The last thing I wanted to hear when I'm talking about how my dad once held up against a wall and strangled me was that I need to consider what he was going through at that time. I finally broke it off with her when I was trying to work through my feelings regarding my kids getting older. It's a massive struggle. I'm sad about it all the time. It just went so fast. I miss the newness, excitement, and wonder of early parenthood. I adore my kids at their ages now, but I just feel stunned most days at how quickly it all went by. I'm trying to find a way to process it all and to cope without constantly breaking down about it. She was extremely dismissive about all of it, as if it isn't a real problem. Then she says to me, I mean, you could look at the bright side. This just means you're closer to having grandchildren. Ugh. I mean, my kids shouldn't have to commit to parenthood just so I can work through my issues. There is a huge possibility my kids won't have kids, and I'm 100% okay with that. I want them to have kids for them, not for me. And hypothetical grandchildren still do nothing at all to help me cope with the feelings I'm experiencing right now in the moment. I really should be in therapy, but I haven't been back since I fired her about this time in 2019. Story 45. I told her about all the abuse I went through as a kid. Her first reaction was, so, you said you played video games? What a wretched habit. I'd never let my daughter play video games, and used the remaining half hour explaining why. Can't believe I accepted to pay. Story 46. I grew up in a severely abusive home, and when I ran away from home after my mom threw me out and then made a fake report about me being missing, I was ordered into therapy. Told the therapist everything, and she told me I was just being childish. Oh, and when I told her about a boy at school harassing me, she told me, maybe you were interpreting it wrong and he is just trying to be your friend. Yeah, I doubt him grabbing my is him just being friendly. Story 47. Told me to just see people more often. I was seeing her because I had social anxiety and school got too much for me. So what do you tell a person who stays at home at least once a week because they are just stressed and in pain? Just do more of it, and you will get used to it. Exposure therapy is a big no for me. I mean, I didn't get used to it the last few years. This obviously doesn't work at all, and neither does it actually cure my social anxiety. Story 48. This is pretty minor in comparison to a lot of these answers, but I had a therapist tell me, have you tried thinking happy thoughts? I was going through a depressive anxiety stretch in early COVID lockdown, where most news and any sort of environmental disaster type of article, for example, a study about the lessening number of insect splatter on cars through the years and the resulting effect on agriculture, would send me spiraling into a panic about our planet's inevitable extinction and death. The therapist told me I was worrying about silly things, to stop reading the news and think happier thoughts. I dropped her the next day. Find someone who acknowledges your struggles, however serious or silly they may be, who makes you feel heard and respected. They should be holding your hand through self-examination, not berating you for your faults. Story 49. You need to lower your expectations. You are getting frustrated and depressed because you expect too much. Makes it pretty hard to get motivated to do anything if you don't expect any good to come of it. Story 50. During sessions, she opened up to me about her personal life. I learned that this professional, who knows all the tricks of the trade, was struggling just as much, if not more so, than myself. It took away some of my hope that the therapy would be beneficial to me. It felt like, if she could not take her years studying in this field and turn her life into a healthy, productive, and happy existence, how would I? Side note, I was in therapy due to anxiety. I did find it helpful and was able to discontinue her services after a few months of bi-weekly sessions. This was simply the worst thing a therapist has told me because of the way it made me view my therapist professionally and the therapy process as a whole. Story 51. I was told by my therapist that my parents were the bad guys in my life when all they've ever done is love me unconditionally and give me things even if it was a struggle. I told my parents and never ended up back at therapy. Story 52. Your eyes are dead inside. You are dangerous. There's something seriously wrong with you. Something broke in your brain. I'm afraid of you. Luckily, I was in quite a good place in my life, so other than making me cry like crazy for a day, and peer into a mirror to look at my eyes to see if they looked dead inside, it didn't affect me all that much. Was a surreal experience. Story 53. A baby is a blessing, not a burden. I was 17 and worried I might be pregnant. I had literally told her it would ruin my life so much I'd probably kill myself. A couple sessions later, I found out she was pregnant, so I think she was projecting. Also, I'm the opposite of religious, and my therapist calling anything a blessing was a red flag for me already. Story 54. My old psychiatrist once listened to all my issues, looked me dead in the eye, and told me he had no idea how to help me or what was wrong with me. Or that time my high school psychologist brought my mom in for a family session, but it ended with them both yelling at me and telling me I was wrong. She didn't even mediate. She just became my mom too. 0. Story 55. When I was a hyper-depressed teenager, my parents took me to a Christian therapist after I had confessed I was questioning the Christian faith. This man actually straight up suggested that I was possibly experiencing demon possession. As a teenager, I thought it was ridiculous and laughed it off. The older I get, the more disturbing I find it that he actually said this to me. No, I am no longer religious. And no, that wasn't the cause of my depression either. Story 56. Get over it. I responded to him, how about you tell me your biggest problem, I'll tell you to get over it, and then you tell me, how does that make you feel? I left and never went back to that idiot. Story 57. My therapist few times had suddenly telling me complete nonsense out of nowhere. It was so bizarre, I couldn't understand if Matrix broke, was I dreaming or what? And then she told me that she suddenly is losing her track of thoughts and that she had cancer-ish problems with her brain in the past, but that it didn't happen for years and now it happens again, but only with me as her patient. Apparently I'm cancer-inducing. Just, wow. Story 58. Not a therapist, but my former psychiatrist dismissed my concerns about being autistic by saying that if you like having friends, you're not autistic. I like having friends, sure, but it's next to impossible to approach people and make friends myself. She also dismissed my sensory problems by saying it's regular teenager complaints. Joke's on her, I've been diagnosed now and actually do have ASD and ADHD. Story 59. You should pray about it instead of just asking me to change your meds. This was a psychiatrist. Nope. And switching from Lexapro to Zoloft did fix the issue. Story 60 wasn't told anything, but she basically fired me as a patient. She never told me herself, another therapist did. She was well into her pregnancy and I was seeing her for my postpartum depression. Perhaps I scared her. Story 61. That I probably started the fight my ex-husband picked while at a friend's wedding in Mexico. Me, trying to leave the altercation and go to the hotel, he continues down the street grabbing the attention of the police. One thing I was responsible for that I shouldn't have done is tell the policia that he was not harming me, and I was okay since they were ready to cuff him. Story 62. Telling me I should be the happiest I've ever been and enjoying every day because I was recently married. It made me feel guilty for being depressed, which just made my depression harder to handle. It's been a long time and I have a much better therapist now, but still feel a little bitter about that. Story 63. The actual truth about what's wrong with me. It really hurt, made me laugh uncontrollably, and then dissociate. But it's what I needed to hear in order to start healing and move away from my maladaptive coping strategies. Story 64. My parents were on the verge of divorce, and this lady told me, imagine your emotions are like a chain holding you to a wall. Just get rid of it. Ah, yes, I'm going to willingly become a sociopath. Story 65. Not me, but told my mom. Had a whirlwind of ridiculous that landed me in therapy at 12 with a psychiatrist. This dude's first words to me, I've never had a parent refuse to see me. My dad went to the office for the original meeting with my mom, but refused to go see the guy. He didn't think I needed therapy, which I didn't. Then he kept asking me what I wanted to talk about. Then he and I discussed an online friend I had who was wanting to visit. The therapist kept telling me this friend will never visit, as if he just knew everything. Then, when session was over, he brought me back out to the waiting room where my mom was. She needs to lose weight. He said this in the waiting room, in front of another family. They giggled. I was forced to go for multiple sessions, but when I was told I didn't have to anymore, I stopped. My mom went and told this guy to his face that I hated him. Apparently, he was shocked. Story 66. I said I sometimes felt hopeless and was really depressed. She suggested electric shock therapy. She even got on the phone with the local hospital psych ward and made me talk to the admitting nurse to try to voluntarily check myself into the psychiatric ward. I wasn't even suicidal, I was just talking about my feelings. It was awful. Made me never want to go back to therapy. Story 67. First session. I tell her I was abused as a child by a family member. At the end of the third session, I reveal I was raped by two guys with my best friend of the time a few years back. The appointments go on and never talked about it. After 3 months last week, she told me Elle was a strong person and to call her in September. Story 68. She asked if I was religious. I said no. She then spent 20 minutes telling me how brave I was for not believing in God and still living my life. I was there because my grandmother just died, and we moved in with my granddad. Story 69. When I was a kid, a therapist would take me on trips once a week. He took me to an arcade and we played Bloody Roar. I did the same move over and over, and when he lost, he hit the machine really hard and screamed, "Shit, is that all you can do?" I was around 10 at the time, and this guy was in his 30s, so it was awkward. I told him I can go easier, and he got pissed and took me home. Never seen him again. Story 71, when I was suicidal, said I just need life coaching. Another said get a job, that will help. Currently with a fantastic therapist, though, who has been an absolute lifesaver. Story 71. Therapist tried really hard to convince me that the abdominal pain I was stressed about having was just anxiety. I explained that I had digestive issues, but she insisted that anxiety can affect digestion. I explained that the doctors had noticed an immune response and my inflammation markers were high, indicating an infection, but they couldn't find the infection, so they had no idea what was going on. She replied with, "Anxiety can cause an immune response. That's why the doctors can't find anything." Sometime later, when I had my anxiety more under control, she asked me if it helped my pain, and I told her that my pain was exactly the same, maybe a little worse. She told me that wasn't right. My better mood should make me feel better. I explained that I was still getting a lot of medical tests done, and she decided I was in denial about how anxious I actually was. IF popped out that my gallbladder is non-functioning and rather inflamed. It took a long time to find it because I got normal ultrasounds, and typically a low-functioning gallbladder has gallstones. I didn't have gallstones. The doctor got tipped off to a gallbladder issue when I had an attack triggered by my contrast drink for an MRI, and I couldn't walk because I was in so much pain. I am on a wait list for surgery. If I had listened to her and stopped seeking medical care, who knows how long I would continue suffering with this pain. Story 72. So I've basically seen a ton of therapists in my life. I've always been depressed and stuff. I'm transgender, MTF, and when I got to see this therapist for the first time, he asked me to do a little recap about my problems, etc. I told him I was transgender and that it was truly one of the most painful problems of my life. He said, "Well, let's cure this out." He actually said it in French, and it is slightly different. Don't know how to explain it. He meant that he could cure me from my trans identity, as if it was my problem. I told him that I wanted to be helped to come out and transition as I would like to, and that being transgender wasn't curable, but he kept saying that if that hurt me, that was the thing to cure. I barely stood the rest of the conversation, and never called him back. Pretty sure I terribly explained it, but I felt so bad it took months for me to see other therapists back again. Please excuse my English, as I've been telling you. I'm French, and English isn't intuitive at all for me, that's. Story 73. Also, when I did see a therapist for anxiety, they told me to do things that scared me, like going to social events and doing activities that got my adrenaline going. I wasn't even able to go to school or see my normal friends BC. My anxiety was that bad. And I tried doing what he said, and it legit induced panic attacks. Story 74. 2 years after I graduated college, I was unemployed, wickedly depressed, and feeling stuck in my area of study. Film editing. My psych says, just because you enjoy doing something doesn't mean you're good at it. It was a little too tough love for me, and wildly inaccurate, as I am now working in my field and thriving.